Hey, everybody. In this episode of the Backpacking Light podcast, we interview Backpacking Light contributor Rex Sanders about his work in developing battery bench and testing portable battery chargers.
Look for me in the mountains where walking has a way of pulling you to your peace of mind every day.
Welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan.
And in this episode, we are chatting with longtime Backpacking Light contributor Rex Sanders. Rex has been designing and running comprehensive tests on portable battery chargers for some months now. It's a fascinating interview that we have coming up for you and a valuable article that I actually teased in our last podcast. But before we get to that, Ryan, what have you been thinking about lately?
Vandalism. We do most of our hiking in northern Colorado, and so its proximity is proximate to a big city and a population center, the Front Range, and Denver, and so you get a lot of people hiking in this region of the mountains, and there's always a couple bad apples, and so the Colorado Rockies tends to have more vandalism than some other areas of the West. And there's a lot of initials scratching in trees and graffiti painted on rocks and things like this. And it's all over, it's in the national parks. It's also in the national forests, Arapahoe and Roosevelt around here. And every time I see it, I have such a visceral reaction to it, negative reaction. Mm-hmm. And there are so many people out here enjoying the beauty of the Colorado Rockies responsibly, but then there's these few that for one reason or another feel like it's okay to scar a tree or paint a rock, and I'm learning about this. So I'm studying the psychology that goes into people vandalizing either national park or federal property to vandalizing natural features, and this is not a new thing by any means. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because there's various categories of motivations. There's just pure naivety. People don't understand or have never been taught about leave no trace or what's right and wrong out here. The second one is, I know this is wrong, but I'm going to do it myself. And then there's categories within that that motivate people to vandalize property. And it's like there's some that are just anti-government. They don't think public lands should be in the hands of the federal government. So there's that fraction. And then there's this pseudo-libertarian fraction that just believes that they should have the right to do whatever they want on public lands. And then there's a third category that is, it's kind of like, I want to take a picture of what I'm doing. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to say, this is a social media phenomenon, but I will say that social media has amplified the extent to which people are vandalizing public lands. There are also people, and we know this from various high-profile news cases that have happened over the last 5 years, that some people are vandalizing things, making art, so to speak, and then taking pictures of their art and posting it on social media, hoping to get some kind of social cred out of it. So, on one side, it's really disheartening, but on the other side, there's an increasing movement, especially among people who are local to the region that want to really care for their lands. And we know that federal land management agency budgets are declining and the staffing is going down, and these guys just don't have as much bandwidth as we hope they would in order to clean this stuff up. Right. And so it's heartening to me to know that land management agencies are being receptive to the public working with them, where the public can volunteer to clean some of this stuff up. So I want to share an encouraging story. Stephanie and I were hiking on a trail near Estes Park, Colorado, and it's a trail that we hike regularly, and we saw some new graffiti on the rocks. And so I contacted the Arapahoe National Forest and said, hey, we saw this. We would love to be involved in the cleanup. What's the process? And I have to be honest with you, I was a little bit skeptical that my email would just end up in the ether.
Right.
And to my surprise, the next morning, the public relations specialist, who obviously monitors this email address, contacted me and said, I have sent your email to law enforcement, the law enforcement officer in charge of that region, and the trail and wilderness supervisor who's in charge of managing vandalism. And so both of them contacted me and said, hey, here's the process. We'd love to have you involved. And the whole thing is kind of turning out really neat. So it's going to take a little while to learn how to remove the graffiti safely, because a lot of these chemicals are really toxic. And so they have certain protocols, but it's encouraging to know that, okay, here's a functional government agency that is willing to work with us, the public, to volunteer to do some things. And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, we're really at the confluence of a lot of different things. And as you continue to study this, I'll be interested in hearing from you about what you learned. But so you mentioned social media. There's also been a very measurable, huge increase in traffic in the outdoors, especially these close to population center areas since the pandemic started. Yep. And I think that those numbers were trending upwards anyway, even before the pandemic started, right? Yep. So then at the same time, you have declining budgets and staffing in these public agencies. And so it's kind of the swirl of a worst case scenario all at once here.
It is. And then you've got this rise of people who are feeling emboldened to express themselves in unconstructive ways as well.
Yeah, I agree with you that it's heartening to learn that that there's a way to approach this problem that feels like doing something, as opposed to just reading a news article about 10,000-year-old petroglyphs defaced, and then you feel terrible for the rest of the day. So yeah, definitely reach out to your local land management agencies and see what you can do to help.
Yeah, now there's a flip side to this. I've been following Benny Braden's work with developing the Responsible Stewardship Organization. Benny's out in the East. I believe he's the vice president of Save Our Smokies, which is a stewardship organization for the Smoky Mountains. And he posts a lot about this. And the vandalism out in the Smokies, as you well know, is horrendous. I've never seen anything like it. And I've never seen anything like it out west. I have seen it in Shenandoah. I've seen it in the Smokies, some other places along the AT corridor. But it is shocking to me, based on Benny's experience with land management agencies out there, how strapped they are for resources, or how futile they kind of look at vandalism, because there's just no feedback loop to get this fixed. And so Benny has really taken a leadership role out there to empower people to get involved and sort of kind of take the bull by the horns and take care of stuff. And he is definitely taking care of stuff. So it's super encouraging to me to see that out there as well.
All right, well, we'll put a button on this issue, and we'll definitely talk about it again in future podcast episodes. Maybe we can even have Benny Braden on. That would be fantastic.
That would be awesome.
Him. Yeah. Well, I'd like to transition now to our interview. And our interview this month is with Rex Sanders. Rex Sanders is a longtime Backpacking Light contributor, and for the last, 6 months, he's been neck deep in what we've decided to call portable battery chargers. So why don't we just do a little preface of talk about why we're looking at this category of gear, and then we'll jump into the interview.
Well, let me say something about Rex. Rex has been a Backpacking Light member, if you can believe this, since 2004. So he's one of the OGs of the Backpacking Light community, and has contributed so much through the years, not only as a community member, but as a Backpacking Light author as well. Now, I'm really happy Rex is retired, because I think in order to dive into portable battery chargers, you can't be focused on anything else that's very important. And it is a complicated market. has been a very interesting ride to develop tests that give good data, and he's done an absolutely fantastic job. To your question, why are we studying this? I want to touch on this a little bit after the episode or after the interview, but you've got this electronics industry that sells an enormous amount of equipment to consumers. Consumer electronics is a massive industry. Within that industry, the industry of the sub-market of portable battery chargers is totally overwhelming. If you go on a major retail website and look up portable battery charger, you are going to be faced with way more choices than you can sort out. And so I think Rex's mission here is, let's find the best ones we can. And in order to do that, we have to have robust, accurate, and informative testing protocols. And so with that, let's go ahead and introduce Rex and get right into the interview.
Okay, Rex Sanders, thanks for joining us on the Backpacking Light podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So you have been digging into portable battery chargers for how long now? 6 months?
Approximately, yes.
Yeah. So what was the first thing that interested you in this topic?
So several years ago, I took a longer than usual trip with my InReach. And towards the end of that trip, I expected the battery to last the whole trip. Well, it didn't. So when I got back, I started looking into portable battery chargers. And what I found out pretty quickly is that there's a lot of interesting marketing going on around portable battery chargers. And it made it very difficult to figure out what was the reality when it came to how many charges you could get out of a portable battery charger, or whether this 10,000 milliamp battery charger was the same as this 10,000 milliamp hour battery charger. So that's when I started digging deeper.
Right. And so as you started to dig in, can you share a little bit with us about your initial thought process going into designing some of these tests, and then how those tests had to change over time as you started to implement them?
I think you might remember that I pitched this as a 1 month story.
Right.
And I literally thought I could do 3 tests and all the writing in 1 month when I started. And that turned out to be very far from the truth, as I learned over the next 4 or 5 months. The main problem, well, the big problem at the beginning was theory met reality. And what I thought was going to be a really good test turned out not to be a really good test for various reasons. And it was so then it became, well, if this doesn't work, how do I do it? And then the other part that kept happening was tests begat tests. The drop test, the cold test, the overnight tests, I ran into limits on the meters that made me have to redesign tests. So my motto became always more tests. So sooner or later I had, approaching 100 different tests, and I go, this is not going to work. I have to focus in on the ones that are most important to a backpacker trying to select a portable battery charger. So I chose one poor anchor to abuse as I developed these tests, and I ended up with 10 tests that took 11 days, which was kind of long.
Right.
But that was what I ended up with. So eventually I started testing other, and we published the battery bench based on that long set of tests. Then I started testing other battery banks, and I discovered that there really wasn't a lot of difference between them on some of the longer tests. And that was very exciting to me, at least. And I was able to cut 11 days worth of tests down to one long day. And from 10 tests to 6 tests, which might seem non-proportional, but some of those tests literally took 4 or 5 days to run. So it was, I learned a lot along the way, and some of that, what I learned might be useful, but it was quite a lengthy process.
Right. I want to circle back to, generally speaking, how you develop tests, because your mind kind of works in such a way that you're interested in how to develop tests that your average person can use at home, and not just for battery chargers, but for a bunch of different products. So I want to circle back to that. But first, I want to hit on something that you just said, which is that of the 10 tests you developed, only 6 showed meaningful differences between the products. So what I'm interested in is, what were the 4 tests that we can, as consumers, generally count on most of the battery chargers we buy to perform about the same?
The 2 classes, one is the cold tests. So what I learned after I dug into it some more, I said, I ran the cold test on the first Anchor, and I said, it works fine in the cold. And by cold, I mean refrigerator temperatures, not below freezing, which was counter to the conventional backpacking wisdom that you have to keep your battery packs warm. Then I dug into it more on the level of what the specs were for various battery packs and devices. And almost all of them said they are fine to run at any temperature between about freezing and a little over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And that includes charging and recharging and using them and so on and so forth. And many of them can actually be stored, as long as you're not using them, below freezing to 10 or 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that was in the specs of almost everything that I looked at. So testing for that didn't even make sense. The other class of tests that took a long time was what I called the overnight recharging tests. And there I took a fully charged battery pack and hooked it up to an iPhone, or hooked it up to a set of earphones similar to these, and wireless earbuds, and saw how much power was lost overnight during recharging. What I found was not dependent on the portable battery charger. It was dependent more on the device. And so why test the portable battery charger when it's not the battery charger's fault?
Right, that makes sense. I want to focus in on that real quick, because what you found with that particular test was, I think, one of the most actionable, easy to implement takeaways that came out of Battery Bench, which is the overnight wastage that happens especially with iPhones. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was one of the biggest surprises to me too. To back up just a little bit, when I tested the earbuds overnight, charging those, there was hardly any waste at all. So when I tested the iPhone, I was very surprised that it wasted between around 10 to 20% of the portable battery charger's power in one night of leaving your iPhone fully charged and plugged in. So you would think it would take no energy overnight if you start out fully charged. And because that's what I wanted to test. Okay, so let's say you're plugging in your battery, your smartphone every night to keep it charged up. It might recharge in an hour, and then the rest of the night it's supposedly doing nothing. Well, I found out it was actually chewing a lot of energy, and I don't know why. But my recommendation is definitely don't do that.
Right, yeah. That piece of knowledge completely changed the way that I handle recharging my devices in the backcountry. And I went from leaving stuff plugged in overnight to getting into camp, topping some things off, and then unplugging immediately. And it was very noticeable how much more I was able to extend my battery life.
Yeah, I mean, part of it, for me at least, was I'm so used to plugging in my phone overnight or putting it on a charger overnight and waking up in the morning and it's fully charged and it's no big deal. And in the grand scheme of things, the amount of energy you're wasting overnight at home would hardly show up on your electric bill. But one of my favorite new sayings is, a watt hour here, a watt hour there, pretty soon you're adding up to real energy when you're backpacking.
Well, what were some of the other challenges that you had to overcome in running these tests?
Starting at the very beginning, there were supply chain issues, partly due to COVID. There were so many promising battery banks that were out of stock, and out of stock for months because I kept checking. I was almost certain that people would want me to test the Amazon Basics line of battery banks, and anything that met my criteria still hasn't been in stock, 6 months after I started looking. I don't understand what's going on with that. The other part that impacted the tests in that regard was that the market was changing rapidly. So literally 3 of the battery banks that I bought in late summer had been discontinued by the time I started testing a month or two later. And when I went back to even find the specs on some of them, it became a challenge because it had been erased from the manufacturer's website.
Wow.
So I wouldn't be surprised if all of the tests, all of the portable battery chargers in my articles are gone in the near future. It seems to be unlike backpacking stoves that stay on the market for 10 or 15 years, portable battery chargers seem to have the lifespan of a horsefly or something.
Do you have a sense of why that is?
I don't know exactly at this point. What I have seen is a lot of changes in features sometimes. It's almost like they throw out, some companies throw out a bunch of different battery packs with different features, and then the ones that don't sell, they drop. Or they say, oh, wait, people like that feature, we'll put it into a new one or something. I'm not sure. Or maybe it has to do with supply chain issues. We can't get that chip anymore. We can't make that battery charger anymore. Oh, the other big issue I had was a couple more frustrating issues. I had a load tester that I bought to run these tests. And what a load tester does is basically it's a dummy load, so that you can hook your battery pack into a meter, and then on the other side of that meter is a dummy load, so it can pretend like you're charging something up, but it's repeatable, so it will always charge at the same rate, as opposed to your smartphone might decide today it's going to go slow for unknown reasons. And the first one I bought was one of the less expensive models, and it was supposedly intelligent, and about a week or two into the test, the intelligent part went dumb and I couldn't revive it very well. So I went and bought a dumb load tester, and it worked fine because I wasn't using any of the smart features of the load tester. I just needed it to soak up energy and turn it into heat.
Right.
Leads me to my next problem, which was that the load testers, when I put them into a cold environment to have everything cool down first before I started my cold testing, the load testers wouldn't start up. They literally wouldn't absorb any energy, which didn't make any sense to me, and it took me a while to figure that out. So I had to work around that too. And then basically by putting just the portable battery charger in the refrigerator or the cooler or whatever, leaving everything else at room temperature, hooking it all together and then shoving it in the refrigerator, then the load tester would start and it would keep itself warm because it was turning all that wasted energy into heat. So there were the USB meter was complicated. The manual was very limited, as many things are. So there was lots of what I called feature discovery, lots of what just happened that I had to figure out. And the USB meter also had other limitations that I had to work around the USB ports, and it couldn't measure low power reliably. And then one of the weirdest things that took me, more like a week or two to figure out was when I first started doing the cold testing. I had a small digital thermometer, and I thought, okay, the thing that I most want to know the temperature of is the portable battery charger. So I put all the equipment in the cooler. I put the little thermometer on top of the portable battery charger, and within an hour or two, it was, if I wanted the temperature inside the cooler to be somewhere near freezing, because I put ice and water and, a lot of ice and a lot of water in there, it was 10 or 20 degrees warmer after an hour. And I'm like, what happened? So then I moved it to a refrigerator. Same thing. Put ice packs on top and underneath and around the portable battery charger. Same thing. Finally, it occurred to me that the portable battery charger was warming up as it was sending energy out. So when I moved the thermometer a few inches away, all the temperature problems went away.
Oh, man. So once you got, once you sort of worked through all this and got everything worked out and actually started running tests, I'm curious as to what a couple of the surprising test results were.
We covered one of them, which was the overnight recharging of the iPhone. That one was a major surprise, and it wasted, like I said, up to 20% of the battery capacity, which is a fair amount. I mean, you could completely drain a battery in 4 or 5 nights doing that. The other was we mentioned also that the temperature specs, because conventional wisdom was you had to keep your battery packs and your battery powered devices warm at night, and I think that comes from something I saw described elsewhere. It's something on my endless list of tests I haven't gotten to yet. If a smartphone gets cold, it fools its internal charge readings. So you can take like a nearly fully charged phone, make it cold, and it might say, I only have 20% of my charge left. You might do nothing to it, warm it up again, and it'll say, oh, I'm back to 80%.
Yep.
And so people look at their cold phone and say, oh, the cold caused the battery power to go away. Checking the specs, I checked on Apple and I checked on Samsung and I checked on Google phones, and all of them say it's okay to operate them from 32 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's okay to store them from -4 Fahrenheit to 115 Fahrenheit. So they wouldn't say that. I'm sure they're being a little bit conservative with that. I don't think they'd say that if it was not true.
Right, exactly. And from a practical standpoint, it's essentially the same thing. Like whether the battery is actually at 20% or not, I certainly have experienced getting out my phone to use for a piece of navigation or something, and it turns off. I still can't use it whether or not it's actually at 80 or if it or not. So keeping it warm for that reason is important. So I wonder, do you have an idea of if that transfers to batteries as well? Like even though portable battery chargers, even though they might be technically okay within a certain temperature range, is there a decrease in performance in terms of how they operate?
I couldn't detect any significant change in performance when I did my test at refrigerator temperatures, literally just a few degrees above freezing. So
great, that's great to know.
In terms of delivering energy to a dummy load, at least. Now, if you put a smartphone in the equation, no guarantees.
Okay, so we have the cold, we have the energy wastage. Was there anything else that kind of caught you off guard?
The other one was the drop tests. So when I was developing the drop test, that poor anchor that I abused, I dropped probably a couple of dozen times while I was trying to figure out how to do this right, because there were some issues. And it came through with flying colors. So I thought, gee, maybe most portable battery chargers are just fine. Then I took the Nitecore NB 10,000 and NB 20,000 battery banks, and I dropped them in the fairly conservative way that I ended up with, which was 1 meter onto sand. And after 6 drops, they got flaky. The USB ports got wiggly, and they wouldn't. I could tell from hooking them up through a USB meter and stuff, if you just kind of casually plugged them in and didn't think about it, they wouldn't actually send any energy out.
Wow.
You had to kind of wiggle the port around and stuff.
Yeah, are those the carbon fiber versions? Does the Nitecore make a carbon fiber? Yeah.
Yes, this is their lightest battery bank in that category of like 10,000 or 20,000 milliamp hours, and part of that is because they have a carbon fiber case.
Yeah, I looked at those when you first started developing this article, and I almost pulled the trigger on one, and then I started to look at the reviews on the Nitecore website, and I think they were uniformly fairly poor. Did you come across any other performance issues other than the drop test with those battery packs?
I'm thinking. I don't think, they're expensive compared to many others. They mostly it was the drop tests that they had issues with. Otherwise, they exceeded all the others I tested. Not that I've tested a huge number at this point, but certainly on paper they exceeded the others in what I call power density or energy density. So the number of watt hours you get per kilogram of weight.
Right.
They were kind of head and shoulders above almost anybody else.
Well, that's interesting. I wonder how much of the negative reviews are coming from people not being exceptionally careful with a piece of what is essentially ultralight gear. Like in the ultralight world, there are certain pieces of gear that have to be treated with caution in order to maximize their usefulness.
I think that's the case here. When I went back and looked at the Nitecore website, I noticed they have another series of battery packs that have 10,000 and 20,000 milliamp hours capacity. They specifically say that those pass 1 meter drop tests. They don't say anything about that for the carbon fiber version.
Got it. Interesting. Well, what are some general portable battery charger best practices that you've developed coming out of these tests?
Well, we've covered some of these already, but I'll kind of restate them. Don't recharge devices overnight, just until they're full. Maybe like you've developed, when you get into camp, plug things in. When you go to bed, unplug them, or take a look at them from time to time. If the little lights say that everything is full, unplug them then, because you'll waste the least amount of energy. Don't worry so much about keeping batteries and battery packs warm. If it's above freezing temperatures, you really don't have that much to worry about, with the exception, it sounds like, of a smartphone, where it might decide, oh, I'm cold. I have lots of energy and I'm cold. I'm not going to work.
Right.
But it's still very important not to recharge anything below freezing. And this was something that I saw over and over again in manufacturer recommendations. And the reason for that is you can do internal damage to lithium-ion batteries when you recharge them below freezing. And that damage may not show up until several recharge cycles later, when you could get an explosion or a fire. And that's not a good thing.
Right.
So don't recharge things when their temperatures are below freezing. If you want to recharge them while they're in your sleeping bag, that's probably fine, unless you're a very, very cold sleeper.
Right.
One of the things I learned was that battery bank charge LEDs are misleading. They're almost always overly optimistic. So the clearest example I think I wrote about was at one point I had to stop a test when it showed 3 out of 4 LEDs red, meaning that you kind of assumed it had 75% of its charge left.
Right.
When I measured it at that point, it actually had 50% of its charge left.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
So you kind of assume, subtract 1 or something like that. I'm not quite sure.
Right. Yeah. I wonder if it's like, if the measurement is set up so that if it's anywhere between 50 and 75%, it just defaults to 75. So it could be 51%, but still reading as 75. Yes. Yeah.
And when I checked a newer manual from Anchor, they almost explicitly say that buried in the fine print, of course.
This kind of, unless you have any other surprising results, this is kind of a transition to my next question, which is, what should consumers be on the lookout for as they are selecting and purchasing portable battery chargers?
Price is not an indicator of quality or capacity. You have to dig deeper. There are some very good, inexpensive portable battery chargers out there, and there are some not so good and very expensive portable battery chargers out there. So it's you have to dig deeper, and that's just the reality. It's not unlike many other things in life, unfortunately. I think it's best to compare watt hours between devices. If you say, oh, I could get this one or I could get this one, which one should I choose, right? Try to compare watt hours, not milliamp hours or the number of zeros in the name, because there's a lot of marketing fudging going on. Sometimes it takes some digging in order to find the watt hours. It's supposed to be printed on the battery pack itself, because if you take that on a plane with you, TSA needs to be able to say, is this battery pack less than whatever their limit is this week?
Okay.
And I've found battery packs that have it printed in type that's almost impossible to read in various different ways. So that can be a little bit of a challenge. I've had to dig into vendor websites. I've had to download the manual and find that information. I've had to take a photo that they had on their website and blow it up and try to read the inscrutable writing on the side in order to find it. So it's because the other thing is that you can take the milliamp hours, divide it by 10,000. So let's say you have a 10,000 milliamp hour battery. That's a 1. Okay. And then multiply that number by 37. That gives you your watt hours, roughly, because it's anywhere in a range from 36 to almost 39.
Right.
In my research. So if you have a 20,000 milliamp hour battery, then that's 2 times 37, that's 74.
Okay. And if the listeners are feeling lost right now, we'll direct you to Battery Bench, where you spend a lot of time explaining this concept. It can be a little hard to wrap your head around. Yeah,
the industry didn't do itself any favors by choosing a unit that, to the electrical engineer that I'm not really in me, but someone who pays a lot of attention to units. When I first saw milliamp hours, I went, what kind of a unit is that? My other couple pieces of advice are choose reputable brands. Don't try to save $20 on a portable battery bank in order to charge your $1,000 smartphone. Because if you end up with a flaky battery bank, it can do bad things to your smartphone. It doesn't mean you need to pay extra. There's some highly reputable brands that are not very expensive, so it's not that big a deal. But if it looks like, as I like to say, if it looks like someone mashed a keyboard and that's their brand name on Amazon, I would stay away.
That's a good rule of thumb. That applies to a lot of things on Amazon, I think.
It applies to a lot of things on Amazon and other Wild West marketplaces, as I call them. solar battery chargers, a battery charger where one side of it is covered in solar cells isn't worth it for 99% of backpackers. There's just not enough solar cells on the side to provide a significant amount of energy under typical backpacking conditions. Don't pay extra for it. Don't pay extra in terms of grams for it. It's just not worth it. And the other thing to not focus on when you're shopping for a portable battery charger is if this is an 18-watt portable battery charger in terms of the how much power it can send out, not watt hours, but watts, or a 45-watt battery charger, okay, your devices at the other end have to be able to absorb that much too. Most of the things we carry, your headlamp's not going to charge any faster. Your Garmin is not going to charge any faster. Most phones are not going to charge any faster with that 45 watt versus the 18 watt. So if you stay in around the 12 to 18 watt range, you're not going to overpay for some capability you don't really need.
That is really good advice.
I want to back that up just a little bit. Some of the newest smartphones can charge faster, but if you're plugging it in for several hours when you get to camp, it's done in an hour, it's done in 2 hours or 3 hours. Is that worth paying extra?
Yeah, so that leads me to my next question, which is that now on the other side of these tests, or at least, actually, I don't know if where you are in your process, if you've got another couple of months in you or not, I don't know. But if you had to now go out and buy a portable battery charger based on what you've done so far, what would be your purchase?
I have to kind of preface it by saying that I haven't tested that many, so I can't, say that I've surveyed the entire market because it's almost infinite. And the second part is that the capacity of the battery charger is very dependent on your trip and your gear and how you use it. So whether you need a 5,000, a 10,000, a 20,000, a 30,000, that's, are you taking a lot of videos? Are you basically just charging your phone so you can call when you get to the trailhead? Those are two very different scenarios.
Sure.
So if I was to select one for me, I would go with the Nitecore carbon fiber series that we were just talking about, the Nitecore NB series, the NB 5,000, 10,000, and 20,000. But you don't drop them. Handle them carefully. But this, as you pointed out, this is true of many other pieces of lightweight equipment. You have to treat it carefully. It's not rocket science. If I was worried about that for other reasons, like I'm going to have it on a pack raft or something like that, and it might get slammed around, then I would probably go with an Anker model. They seem to be very tough. They're not very expensive, but they keep changing the product line. So I can't even recommend a particular line of Ankers because they literally just changed the product line like 6 weeks ago.
Right.
So it's the Anker battery banks have become so popular that apparently on the Appalachian Trail, everybody just calls battery banks Ankers. Hey, can I borrow your Anker to charge my phone?
Wow, it's become Kleenex. That's fascinating.
At least on the Appalachian Trail. I'm not sure if that's true anywhere else.
Yeah, sure. This certainly goes back to what you were saying about just choosing a reputable brand and kind of just trusting the brand to see you through.
So that would be my advice at this point.
What are some features on portable battery chargers that don't yet exist that you would love to see?
What I would like to see kind of is like a mashup of existing features all in one battery bank. A combination of high energy density like the Nitecore NB series, along with the toughness of the Ankers, so you didn't have to worry about dropping them. easier to see LEDs, because the LEDs on the Nitecores are not that easy to see, particularly on one model. They're like, you have to get your eyes in just the right position to see the LEDs.
Interesting.
Whereas the many others have pretty bright, easy to see LEDs. And then something that's a bit of a industry-wide issue, and that is, this is going to sound strange, but easy to remember button pushes. Is it 2 clicks to turn on this feature or 1 click? Because the other feature that's true across the industry is that there's almost no labels on the thing that you can read. So it's not like you can, turn it over and say, oh, it's 1 click for this and 2 clicks for that. So readable instructions and labels on the cases would be, I think, really good too. The other thing I'd like to see in general with the marketing is to focus on watt hours instead of milliamp hours. And it's kind of a technical thing, but you can't say that this 10,000 milliamp hour battery bank has the same amount of energy as this 10,000 milliamp hour battery bank, because there's other units involved that they don't tell you about.
You've done a lot of writing around that subject in general, around R values, around temperature ratings for sleeping bags, around, I know we've had some conversations around how to measure liters in a backpack. What is it about that idea in the outdoor industry that just riles you up so much?
Part of it is the standards process itself. Okay, so when they came up with a standard to measure backpack volumes, right? They had to go through this long battle in a committee with representatives of the industry to say, how are we going to measure this? What they came up with was something that leaves off pockets that can't close all the way. So what some people call the cup holders on the side of lightweight backpacks, theoretically the volume of those pockets doesn't count.
Right.
Or if you have a big open top mesh back pocket on your backpack, that doesn't count. If it had a zipper across the top, it would count.
Interesting.
And then the size of the balls that they used that they chose to measure the volume with is something that costs an arm and a leg for no apparent reason. If they had chosen something common like a ping pong ball, it would have cost 1/10 as much.
Right. And then that would allow people like us to run our own tests to verify these claims.
And then the other thing that I found out from talking to people in the industry for some of my interviews is that very often what they come up with is something that serves the industry's interests, not the consumer's interests. And that often gets lost in translation. And the sleeping bag temperature tests, I think, are a prime example of that, where almost the entire focus is on what they call the lower limit test, which is the test at which a 25-year-old male dressed from head to toe in warmish clothing with the thing completely closed up can stay barely comfortable.
Right.
And so when you see the whiz-bang 20-degree bag, that 20-degree number is almost always that number. So they do that. And then the other part, in things where there are no standards, like these milliamp hours for the portable battery chargers, there's no particular standard for that, except that everybody measures it at a point that is most advantageous to them. Which is on the terminals inside the battery pack, not at the USB port, not the part that gets delivered to the other end, but on the inside where it has to go through various processes where it loses energy on the way out. So even if you decided that 10,000 milliamp hours was a good unit, you're never going to get 10,000 out of it. And that's just, so if you say, oh, I have a 10,000 battery and I have a 3,000 milliamp hour battery in my phone, you're not going to get 3 recharges out of that because so much energy is lost along the way.
Right. Right. There's an endless amount of ways that they can play games with you.
Yeah.
So as a consumer advocate, I don't know if you describe yourself that way, but I think of you that way based on your work. I know that there's probably people listening to this podcast that are interested in designing and running tests on their gear. And you've designed and run tests on a lot of gear, and I was wondering if you just had any general broad advice for how to go about approaching that idea.
Well, let me tell you about one of the major pitfalls that can discourage people, because this is something that has happened to me over and over and over again. You wake up in the middle of the night, or you're sketching something down, you say, I know how to test that, and then you go and test it and it doesn't work. That's the beginning of the process, not the end of the process. Because then you get to figure out why it didn't work and come up with something that might work. And sometimes that takes 5 or 6 tries. So the other thing I focus on in particular is what is going to make a difference for backpackers, or for me as a backpacking consumer. I don't think of myself as a consumer advocate. I think of myself as a me advocate most of the time. It's like,
right.
I got frustrated by not being able to figure this out. How can I measure it at home? And I'm not, a rocket scientist.
Right.
So when I approach something like the portable battery chargers, it's like, what's the minimum amount of gear and stuff that I can put together at a low enough cost to make this a worthwhile endeavor? And sometimes that takes repeated tries as well. And what I'm hoping to pass along in these articles that I write is the knowledge, so that you don't have to figure all that out for yourself.
Right.
You can go out and buy the test things that I have, which hopefully aren't terribly expensive, and then by following the instructions, do the tests without having to go through all of that pain and suffering. Because it's the knowledge that's I guess kind of critical, because it's too easy to say, oh, this large retailer said it's a 20-degree bag, then I should be able to sleep at 20 degrees.
Right.
As the title of what I consider now a famous Wirecutter article said once, we don't trust manufacturers' specifications. You shouldn't either.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people at this point probably are aware of that concept around certain pieces of gear. I think that the sleeping bag temperature ratings is such a famous example at this point that a lot of people who buy sleeping bags are aware of that lower limit issue. Maybe not raw beginners to the sport, but I know personally speaking, I didn't necessarily apply that to every piece of gear that I own, but in reading and consuming your work in the last few years, it has really taught me to approach everything with a skeptical eye. And I really appreciate that about what you've done.
It's been a journey of discovery for me too, because I came from a background where if something got measured to a standard, you could trust that the standard was well written and that they measured it and they were truthful, and that it was something that you could more or less test when you bought it and took it into your business, in my case. And when I started exploring this same realm for backpacking gear, I was almost flabbergasted that it wasn't like that.
Well, Rex, thank you so much for your time. This has been a fascinating conversation. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that you didn't get a chance to talk about yet, or anything that you feel was important that we haven't really covered yet?
Just briefly, cables are important too. And this is something that I hope to test in the not too distant future. So, that 2-meter cable you bought at the gas station may not be the most efficient way to get power from point A to point B. My general advice until then is to buy shorter, thicker cables from a reputable brand, and Anchor happens to be one of those brands based on other people's tests. The other thing, there's a part of doing these tests on portable battery chargers in particular that kind of tears at my heart, because I want to encourage people to disconnect while they're backpacking.
Right.
It's healthier. You're more connected to the world around you and more creative if you don't have your nose in a smartphone all day long. And if you could leave some of that electronic gear at home, your pack will be lighter and your life will be less complicated. And I know that's not a reality for everybody on many different ways, but it's something to think about. The reason I go backpacking often is to disconnect from the flood, not so much to stay connected. So as much as I might say, oh yeah, well, you probably need a 20,000 milliamp portable battery charger in order to, charge your smartphone up every night after watching videos every evening. Try not watching videos every evening.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of like we always say around here, which is that ultralight backpacking is not a gear list. It's a philosophy, right? And how you apply that philosophy is way more important than what your lighter pack spreadsheet looks like.
Well said.
Yeah. Okay, Rex. Well, thanks again for your time. It's been a great conversation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. And maybe we'll have more.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks again.
Okay, with that, Rex has created this body of data and testing that I hope helps people choose electronic or portable battery chargers for their backcountry electronics. So, Andrew, I'm going to ask you this. What electronics do you take in the backcountry, and what's your strategy for charging them using some type of external battery?
I've waffled back and forth on this a lot in the last few years. I have an iPhone, which I sometimes use as my primary camera, and then sometimes also I supplement that with a point and shoot that also has. I'll bring extra batteries for that as opposed to worrying about charging them in the backcountry. I have a Garmin InReach Mini. I have a Garmin Fenix watch, and I almost always bring a Kindle Paperwhite. That's my electronics. Now, some people would probably look at that and go, "That's a lot to handle." But I also know that I'm not necessarily the person with the most electronic gear in the backcountry either. So, as far as charging goes, I actually been talking to Rex for a few months now about this, and one of the first pieces of information that he gave me as he was writing his article was when he mentioned that iPhones have a lot of wastage when you leave them plugged in, charged in overnight. So that has completely changed my charging strategy. Before I had that information, I would just plug in my portable battery charger to all of the devices that I needed to top off. I also have a multi-unit cord that sort of looks like a squid. It's got 3 or 4 connections in it, and I like to just charge everything at once. So I would leave everything charged in overnight. I do not do that anymore. Now, as soon as I get into camp, I top off what I need to top off, and then I immediately remove it from the charger to preserve battery.
Those are great tips. I learned those from Rex as well. My one piece of electronics that goes with me on every single trip and I use is the Garmin InReach Mini. So that is the main one. Now, if I'm not texting anybody with the InReach on a regular basis, it consumes very little battery. I don't always need to use it for navigation or tracking or anything like that. It's strictly an emergency device on some trips. So it'll stay in my pack and it'll stay off. Now, I don't need a battery charger for that use case. If I'm on a big trip, I will often turn on tracking, and I will do some messaging to keep Stephanie and Chase kind of informed about what I'm doing, or to get, Seattle Mariners scores and things like that. So in that case, I am using my Mini throughout the day, and it does require some recharging. The second piece of equipment I use more than anything else is my phone. Also, I'm in your camp. I sometimes bring a supplemental camera. Most often I'm using my phone camera, and I'm using my phone for navigation. So this is what I'm using for maps and marking waypoints and things like that, route finding. So I use Gaia GPS for that. And when you have a lot of phone use in a navigation app, it does consume phone battery. And so it requires recharging at least once every 2 days, sometimes once a day, depending on how long of a route I'm doing. And then I use a rechargeable headlamp. So those are the three main pieces of gear I'm using in the backcountry. Sometimes I'll take a fitness watch. Sometimes I won't. That consumes very little battery life. But again, I'm with you. I have now switched from leaving things plugged in, and I had been keeping them inside my sleeping bag because, cold kind of messes with charging efficiency. But now I'm with you. I usually keep stuff. I arrive to camp, start recharging my devices, and then by the time I go to bed, everything's unplugged, gets stored in my sleeping bag, and I've been able to eke out a lot more battery life out of my portable battery charger as a result of that. I was surprised by the bleed, especially iPhone bleed. It's shocking.
I think the last thing I would say about overall strategy is, I think in the through hiker philosophy, and so much as I understand what that means anymore, is I think to carry a smaller, lighter portable battery charger, if you carry one at all, but mostly it's popping into a gas station, a coffee shop on the side of the trail, hanging out for a few hours, topping off your devices, and then getting back on the road.
Yep.
The last big trip that I did, it was a 12 or 13 day trip. We had one opportunity to do that, and I made an intentional choice to bring heavier and more overall battery power so that I wouldn't have to, in the middle of my trip, sit in a coffee shop and charge my stuff for 3 hours. I was seeking to avoid that experience.
Me too. I can't stand that. And I'm not a through hiker. I tend to have my preference is for long distance trips without resupply, long duration trips. So I'd rather not go in and resupply in a town. But when I've had to, I like to spend as little time as possible in the town, because while I recognize that there is an element of experience in traveling long distances through towns, there's a positive aspect to engaging with the town and talking to the people, getting to know the community and the town's geography and things like that. That's all good stuff. But I know when I'm going into a town for pure function, resupply, I need to get food for the next leg, I don't want to fool around with anything. And so I want to do what I want to do, get out and get back on the trail. And usually that's kind of feeds into my driven mentality to do as much as I can in the wilderness versus a town. And if I want to go visit towns, I'm going to do a road trip,
Right, because none of the stuff that you just mentioned, the getting to know the community and the engaging with it, none of that happens while you're sitting, underneath the table at a gas station, stealing electricity from them and hoping, no one's talking to you but other hiker trash, and you already know all them anyway. So
yeah, for sure.
All right, well, let's move into talking about some gear. I know there's a pack that you have been looking at lately.
Yes, I'm testing out the Atom Pack's Nanu. Now, this is not a backpacking pack, but it feeds into the theme of what I want to kind of explore today. And, we talked a little bit about responsible stewardship. We talked a little bit about this huge consumer electronics industry where so much of this goes to waste. And that's touching back to that. That's what I'm really hoping Rex's work is going to contribute to, is to help people identify quality electronics that last a long time. And that question of lasting a long time is one that Rex is studying which I really appreciate. What's the lifespan of these battery chargers and how fast do they decay? I think that's a really important question. Okay, so back to the Atom Packs Nanu. This is a day pack sized pack, small. It is very durable. So it's made of a variant of Dimension Polyant that has a Cordura-like outer face and a very strong VX25 grid pattern. So my draw to this pack was not only the fabric, but also the quality of Atom Packs construction, which I've owned another Atom Packs in the past, and the quality is phenomenal. The seams are strong and robust, and they can hold weight. So I know that my Atom Packs are not going to fall apart if I load them as much as I want to load them. Okay, so we've got fabric, durability, we've got quality. The third component that really intrigued me about this pack was its versatility. So it is designed as a pack that can cross multiple disciplines. It is a standard, I'm going to say, through hiking like backpack design, in that it's got 2 side pockets, 1 rear pocket, and a roll top closure and a top strap. Okay, that's it. The neat thing inside is that it does have a padded laptop sleeve, and I like this because I'm really intrigued to use this for travel and maybe office commuting. In addition, I've been using this as my day hiking backpack here in the winter. It holds enough to have an entire winter kit for the type of day hiking I like to do. And it rides high enough and stable enough that I'm really hoping to use it as a biking commuting bag. So these 3 things solve 3 problems for me that I'm really hoping will result in one product lasting a very long time to solve those 3 problems. And to me, that's like the pinnacle in simplicity when it comes to backpacking gear. So you're looking at sustainable products that are extremely versatile and light enough to be considered light, and this certainly is.
Yeah, and I like the idea of being able to use it for multiple disciplines, because if you are interested in any of the backpacking and multi-sport activities, or even just disparate sports, you end up with a gear closet it's redonkulous. And being able to, especially packs, for some reason, I don't know about you, but packs tend to be the thing that I end up with. Like, all of a sudden I have 4 or 5 of them, and my wife is like, how did this happen?
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So yeah, this is very intriguing to me. What's the leader size on this? Do you know?
I think it's about 22. I haven't measured it yet. I'm not sure what their spec says, but my guess is it's in the 22 to 23 range.
All right, cool.
Okay, now we just published a review of a brand new tent on the market, the Durston Gear X-Mid Pro 2. So this is a 2-person dynamic composite fabrics. He calls it a single wall. I call it a hybrid because the vestibules are effectively a double wall. 21 ounces, somewhere in there, for a 2-person tent that actually probably fits most couples. So what do you think about this? I know this is on your radar, and Mark Wetherington, who wrote the review, just shipped me the tent for some photography and additional testing. So I'm super excited to try this out.
I have not gotten my hands on this shelter yet, but I obviously spent a lot of time reading and working on the review, and also am familiar with the Sil polyester version of this shelter because we've also published a review on that. And so just on paper, there are 2 things about this shelter that really, really stand out to me and are attractive. One is the offset pole design. So it's a 2-pole shelter, but the poles aren't in your way as you get in and out of the shelter, side entry. That is so crucial, just to your overall quality of life. And then the second thing is that you can set this up with 4 stakes minimum. And it's got a square footprint, which is something that I would say maybe the biggest competitor offset two-pole shelter, the Stratospire LI. It does not have a square footprint, and that's a great shelter. I've talked about it on the podcast before. It's one of my favorite two-person shelters ever, but it's not easy to set up at all. And I've struggled with it sometimes in high wind situations or in imperfect campsites. So on paper, being able to set this thing up quickly, simply, get a perfect pitch every time, that's very attractive to me.
The thing that struck me about the pitch, especially in comparison to the Stratospire. Now, you and I have backpacked in the Beartooths up in Montana, and you had the Stratospire with you. And it's a really beautiful tent when you get it right. It's stable, it's weather-worthy, but it takes some time, right? And if there is a little bit of finicky ground undulations, it can be pretty challenging. And it requires, I spent so much time with the Stratospire, and the thing I noticed about it was the more I knew about geometry, the better I got at pitching the tent. Now, not everybody wants to learn geometry. And the Durston X-Mid Pro solves this because it is dead simple to set up. If you can make a tent a rectangle, if you can pitch a rectangle, you can pitch this tent tight almost every time, and it looks and performs in terms of wind resistance beautifully. So that's the thing I really like about it. Now, I've used the Sierra Designs High Root FL1, which I don't think is no longer made, but that tent had some of the DNA that the Durston X-Mid Pro inherited, but I think these are two totally different tents. I think the High Root FL1 had a huge profile that was subject to high wind loading because its walls were so steep. The X-Mid Pro solved some of this. The other thing I really like about it is once you have the exterior set up as a rectangle, the interior actually sits in the rectangle on diagonal. So this is hard for some people to cope with aesthetically because the ends of the inner tent are going to be not squared. So it's a parallelogram, the inner tent shape, the footprint of it. And so that messes people up. But when you put two people in it, it's brilliant because the two pads can be offset a little bit. You can put the head of one person at one end, the head of the other person at the other end, and their feet are not touching your head. This was mind-blowing to me when I actually experienced this. Now, if you're super tall, that might not be the case. But for two regular-sized people, this actually is a pretty positive thing. So if I'm hiking with you and I want to share a tent, I don't want your feet banging my head. And I really appreciated that design element. I don't know if this was intentional or if this was an outcome of this particular design, but I was intrigued by that.
All right, well, as we wrap up here, let's transition into our last segment, which is what's new at BPL. I'd like to point people towards a series of articles that we are publishing about freeze drying. We talked about freeze drying a couple times on the podcast. We tasked BPL author Drew Smith with exploring the capabilities of a piece of equipment called the Harvest Right home freeze dryer, which again, we've talked about before. You had one. This is actually the unit that you owned that Drew is using now. We are having Drew give us one article a month on freeze drying. And what I like about the way he's doing this is that he is talking about freeze drying best practices, general food prep best practices, some of the history and science behind freeze drying, which is really interesting, especially if you're a nerd like us. And then he's finishing each installment with a recipe. So I think that his articles are useful and very actionable, and I think that they mesh nicely with a lot of the other stuff that we've talked about in terms of food.
In his last installment, Drew talked about freeze drying his favorite takeout food. So he goes to this restaurant. It's a Thai restaurant in Boulder, Colorado. That's one of his favorites. And he orders his favorite Thai dish there, brings it home and freeze dries it. Rehydrates it in the backcountry and is blown away by the taste of home, right? when I was using the freeze dryer, my favorite thing to do was take my favorite meals that Stephanie cooked and freeze dry them and rehydrate them in the backcountry. And same kind of deal. Just he uses takeout. I did at-home meals. And to me, that is one of the most powerful uses of a freeze dryer that makes it so easy to prepare meals. It's difficult to do this with dehydrated meals because with dehydrated meals, every ingredient dehydrates at different rates. There are ways to do this with full meals, but it requires some knowledge and practice. With a freeze dryer, it's a no-brainer. You put your favorite meal into the freeze dryer, you literally press the button, and you come back when it's done, and it's ready to go. And to me, that's one of the most neat things about using a home freeze dryer to prepare backpacking meals. Now, these units are expensive. They're a couple $1,000s a piece, but the ability to, there's two ways I can see making these work financially. One, share it with somebody. So pull in together, buy one. You're not going to run it 24/7 at your own place. So if you can share this with two or more people, you all can get benefit out of it for much less capital outlay, right? And the second thing is use it to freeze dry your leftovers, your food that you don't want to spoil, and your home cooked meals and your favorite takeout. It just makes everything so easy. And once you freeze dry something, it lasts a really long time and it's not hard to preserve. Sometimes dehydrated meals, when you try to preserve them, they go bad. And that can be difficult to sort out in a dehydrated meal. But with a freeze-dried meal, you throw it in a Mylar bag, zip bag, put an oxygen absorber in there, pull the air out, zip it up, and you're set. And it's just so easy. I've never had anything spoil freeze drying, and it's just easy. It just makes everything so easy. I love that.
Don't you have a guacamole meal that's like 180 calories an ounce or something like that?
So,
that's
the other huge benefit is you pull so much moisture out of there. I mean, you can get your foods down to 1% to 2% moisture. And the result is a caloric density that's through the roof. So yeah, I freeze dry avocados and make guacamole, put some tomatoes and lime juice and spices in there, freeze dry it, and it comes out at 180 calories per ounce. It's absolutely remarkable. It tastes fantastic. I mean, there is another brand of commercially available freeze dried guacamole on the market. It's not very good. It is just, I mean, do your own ingredients. You can use fresh foods, which helps tremendously in the taste. And I love the control over my food with the freeze dryer.
All right. Well, what do you have on your plate coming up at BPL?
We are, it's a new year, new phase. We're not exiting the pandemic, but we're entering a new phase of the pandemic where we're kind of leveling out, and it's probably here to stay for a little bit, and we're just getting back into routines. I feel like 2022 is the year of new beginnings and establishing post-pandemic routines. So we've been investing a lot into strategic planning and trying to figure out, okay, who do we want to be in the next phase of Backpacking Light? And so we're really trying to focus on website development. We're getting ready to start our next phase of website development this month. And so we're doing an audit of everything and reviewing all the bug reports and support issues that have come in for suggestions from our members about what to do next. And so we're auditing that and deciding our vision from here. The other thing we're doing is really trying to focus our vision and mission. I mean, Backpacking Light, we've been around for 21 years. We have tried everything. We've been a print publisher, an online publisher. We've made our own brand of gear. We've sold it through a retail outlet. We had a mail order business. We have a guiding school, instructional guiding program. And then we do all the online stuff, of course. And so we've tried a whole bunch of different stuff. And so now we're in that process of focusing so that we can do what we do best. And from a strategic standpoint, the unique thing we've always brought to the industry is information that people can trust. And so we're really honing in on that and doubling down. As you know, we had a conversation about this today about article content, that we really just want to focus on how can we help people thrive outside and do it in a way that gives them access to reliable, trustworthy, objective information that's free from all the, commercial bias and lack of expertise and all the other junk that's out on the internet. So that's where I'm focusing right now. We're involved in a really deep strategic planning phase over the next couple months, and I'm excited to see what comes out of it, because it'll have an impact not only on our activities as a company, but on our messaging and marketing and how we grow our article base, how we develop our membership, and how we develop our staff, our team, and build their careers in a way that is so satisfying. I mean, I want nothing more than you to get up every morning and be super psyched to go to work.
All right. Well, exciting things happening in the next few years for sure. And we'll continue creating and developing cool podcast content as well. We've started this series where we interview cottage gear makers. I'm very excited about some of the people we're thinking about to interview for that. We're going to continue recording audio essays. Those have been very popular episodes. And of course, we'll continue with these long, deep dives into complicated topics that we have to interview experts on. So very excited about what's happening for the listeners and readers at Backpacking Light.
Yeah, I think in conclusion, I just want to say I wrote this down in my brainstorming notes the other day. Is like, what do we do as a company? We, like you and I and the rest of our staff, we really committed to learning new things. So we study and we grow as individuals. We do research because there's so much information out there that you have to curate it and interpret it in a way that is valuable to the people that are reading what we're writing and viewing our videos and things like that. And then the core of what we do is we're content creators. We make content. And I always wondered, what are the 3 attributes of killer content? And I came up with the 2 that we've always done, which is we want to inform you, and that's got to be valuable for you. We want to educate you because we want to see you grow. But the third thing, and this is the part that really kind of excites me, is I want to create content that delights people, that inspires them and makes them feel good about going outside. Because ultimately, I don't want you sitting in front of the computer digesting content all day. I want you to take what you've learned at Backpacking Light, go outside, because it's based on the core belief that I think spending time outside makes humans better. And ultimately, that's what we're in business to do.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Backpacking Light podcast. The Backpacking Light podcast is advertising free, thanks to the membership fees paid by Backpacking Light members. A BackpackingLight.com membership gives you access to 20 years of archives, forums, and online courses. And don't forget, if you're an unlimited member, you'll get the video version of this podcast for free as a part of your membership. So please consider supporting this podcast and become a member right now at backpackinglight.com/membership.
You can download the show notes for this episode at backpackinglight.com/podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. It does help other people find the show.
Thanks for listening to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan. And if we can leave you with one parting message, it's this: pack less, be more, because lighter is better. Happy trails, everybody.
So I shoulder my backpack, walk away from the car.